What's up, everybody? We're back at it here to talk Chrisley Knows Best. Gets caught, indicted, charged, tried, convicted, and sentenced recently. And we know there's going to be an appeal coming. So we wanted to talk a little bit about how these types of cases get tried, get charged, get handled, get defended. And to do that, I'm bringing on my dad, who's a former federal prosecutor, federal criminal prosecutor, who prosecuted a ton of crimes just like this: tax evasion, wire fraud, bank fraud. And we've also defended a ton of cases like this. And we have some right now in our office that are similar to this that we handle on a federal level. So I'm going to bring him in today to talk about what prosecutors think and how they charge and investigate these cases. We're also going to talk about how we defend them on the criminal defense side. But most importantly, we're going to talk federal sentencing guidelines, how the Chrisleys got the time that they got, what we think they'll serve, what the supervised release will look like, and what their best appellate arguments may be based on other similarly situated defendants and similar cases. So take a second, hit that like button, follow us on Instagram and Twitter if you haven't already. But let me bring my dad in here. Hello there.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. How
You can
doing?
hear me good?
I can hear you well. Can you hear me?
All right.
All right.
All right. So we are good. Okay. So to start out, the Chrisleys, they get charged with more than 10 counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, bank fraud, conspiracy, what we call white collar crimes, right? So when a federal prosecutor gets a case like this, a high profile case, a big criminal defendant, a lot of money, scoot this way just a little bit because I can't. Yeah, there you go. What do they look at, and how do they investigate these crimes specifically that may be different than the drug crimes or murder or charges like that?
Well, here's what I've learned about this particular case, and it's common. There's two ways that tax cases, which this basically is a tax case, the IRS is really what did this case. Two ways that they really find out or really catch you. One is they know how much money you make, and they know that you didn't pay taxes on it. Two is a net worth analysis, where they see how you're spending money, and the amount of money you're spending does not coincide with the amount of taxes you're claiming that your income. And that's what this case was. Apparently, some IRS agents watched the show, knew that in 2009 they had trouble paying their taxes, or they were slow or delayed in paying their taxes or filing their returns. And yet, on the show, they're talking about spending $300,000 that year on clothes. So he saw that and said, this doesn't really match up. How can they have an income that justifies $300,000 in clothes, and yet they're not paying my agency, the IRS, the taxes that they're due, and not showing the income that would justify that kind of spending? That's where it started.
Right. And I think that's what's interesting about this case specifically when we talk about normal people, even normal people with money, right? There's a difference between being rich and being famous. And people say sometimes that you want to be rich, you don't want to be famous, because when you're rich and famous, like the Chrisleys and like Girardi and like the other housewives that have already been convicted of similar crimes, when you try to do some of the same deals that less famous rich people do to save on taxes, but you're bragging about how much money you're spending, and you file for bankruptcy here in this company or personally, but you still have this company on the side funneling millions of dollars through it, all of those parts are part of this case. They say they don't have money when it comes to the IRS. They say they don't have money in bankruptcy documents, but then they go on TV, they go on podcasts, and they blast out how much money they have, how much money they spend, how much money they make. A lot of this is also public, how much money they have and how much money they make. So as a federal prosecutor, when you're looking at all of that information coming to you, how do you choose which charges to bring? Like, how do you pick whether it's wire fraud or bank fraud or how many to pick? Because every transaction is technically a different crime, right?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, looking at these charges, there was one charge they didn't bring that I don't understand how they could not bring a money laundering charge.
I agree.
Because money laundering is using a bank, a federally chartered bank, for any kind of illegal transaction involving money. And there had to be thousands of illegal transactions here. They never charged money laundering, which has a pretty serious penalty in itself. But put that aside, because I don't know what went into the decision making. But what you really do is you take a look at the easiest crimes to prove, number one. Number two, you take a look at the crimes that have the most called sex appeal, the largest amount of dollars, the largest amount of fraud. Prosecutors are human. Sometimes you catch somebody and they don't have any money. They did this just to survive so they could feed their family. Obviously not the case here. So that's why this case had a lot of sex appeal, because it was a high publicity, high net worth, and frankly, in looking at the conduct that I saw, pretty outrageous conduct. And they also had some really good evidence, and they had a cooperating witness. So you put all that together, and this is a really good case. Let's go to trial.
And they can't really plead to anything, right? You offer deals like this and you see what they end up getting sentenced with. The plea deal would not have been any lower than that. The prosecutor was asking for a lot more than what ended up getting handed down by the judge as far as their sentence goes, which we'll get to their sentence in a minute. But you talked about damning emails where he said, just make it happen. If you can't make it happen, get a different crooked accountant to do this for me. You made it look like I had $4 million last time instead of $700,000. Do it again so I can get this loan. And if anybody doesn't know, a lot of this centers around the Chrisleys providing fake personal financial documents from banks in order to get loans in large amounts that they don't pay back, and they file for bankruptcy. And then they get paid from their TV shows into this 7 C's corporation and still claim personally that they don't have any money, yet they're using all of that money in their private corporation for personal use. And it's fraud. I mean, it's just basically fraud. When we all heard, I remember when this show was on and we were all hearing in the news that they were filing for bankruptcy, and we're like, what? Look at this house that they have. They spent $300,000 on Gucci this and Fendi that, and none of it really made sense. And sometimes it's exactly what it seems like, and it's exactly what it looks like. So from a prosecutor side, with all that evidence, you want to say something else?
I do. I want to say that, keep in mind, the corporate structure they set up was legitimate. You can have a corporate structure like that. You can pay your money into a corporation. But their problem was when they were asked about the corporation, they lied, or they transferred ownership to the mother in order to avoid it looked like that asset was their asset. So the structure wasn't bad. It's the way they used the structure.
Right. So then if we flip it now, and on a defense side, doing these federal criminal white collar cases, we talk all the time about how it's a 99+% conviction rate, but we've actually won some white collar, some Medicare fraud trials representing doctors. And we've won on that side and been part of that 1% with you leading the defense team from our firm. How do you defend cases like this? When it feels like there's a lot of evidence, your client maybe has done some dumb stuff publicly, online, on TV for everyone to see, written some emails that could sound bad because they were angry in the moment because they couldn't pay off some debt that they had. How do you start to build a defense in a case like this?
Well, number one, the key element to a lot of it is intent. Can you show where they intentionally did this? Or was it just bookkeeping errors, stupid mistakes, not understanding the tax code, which certainly nobody understands the tax code, and doing really dumb things. So you start with seeing if you can prove that it was accidental, I guess is a good way of putting it, that they didn't intentionally defraud the government. They just didn't pay some taxes. A lot of people make mistakes on their tax returns. We made a mistake on our tax return. Happy to pay the government the taxes we owe. But it's not a crime because we didn't intentionally defraud the government. We just made a mistake on our return. We claimed too much money as a deduction for a car, or we took a trip.
Lots of people do.
Right. We took a trip and we said it was business and it really was just for pleasure, and we deducted it. Okay, we'll pay the taxes on it. So that's number one, is to show intent. Number two, you've got to take a look and see, do they have the evidence to prove that this was actually a fraud? In this case, they had some problems. In the emails that I read, they were pretty damning emails. And then you've got a cooperating witness. You have a cooperating witness in almost every large tax case because there are so many people involved in the tax case. It's not like a murder where it's just you and the guy you killed. You have to have accountants. You've got to have partners. You've got to have financial advisors. You've got to have all sorts of things when you're this big and have this much money rolling around. somebody's bound to flip. And mostly it always happens that way.
All right. So before we move on, Tori and Azam are Tori's asking for Azam, but Azam is asking what this case is kind of about. So to give a really quick, get us up to date here, because we want to talk specifically about federal sentencing, which is where we're getting. Todd Chrisley and his wife, I can't remember what her name is, Mrs. Chrisley. Julie Chrisley, had a reality TV show called Chrisley Knows Best. Is that what it's called?
Yes, they actually had 2 shows, but yes.
I actually, that just made me blank because Hogan Knows Best was a show too, right? With Hulk Hogan.
Yes.
So it's a reality TV show just like that, where the dad is this type of patriarch. He's kind of a very loud, flamboyant type of obnoxious guy, very rich, Southern style, keeping up with the Kardashians, blonde hair, blue eyes type of family, multiple kids, all sorts of antics and things going on with him and his kids the whole time, as you'd expect from a reality TV show. It went on for, I think, at least like 10 years. Tons of money, flaunting it everywhere, similar to Erica on the Real Housewives. And it turns out he was also not paying his taxes. He was also filing for bankruptcy. He was also getting millions and millions of dollars of loans, and it all caught up with him. And eventually he was indicted federally. The trial happened earlier this year. He was convicted, and he was just sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His wife was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. I think 16 months of supervised release afterwards.
16 months probation, 3 years supervised release.
Okay, so afterwards, but the bulk is they're going to prison combined almost 20 years. They may stagger it because they do have some kids. So that's where we're at right now. So all of these charges, bank fraud, wire fraud. Oh, I was going to say one other defense we commonly use is detrimental reliance. Basically, you rely on a professional. You gave your accountant the information. I didn't know what they were doing. That seems like part of their defense in this case, that other people were doing all this, impersonating him. The accountant had power of attorney. He never wrote those emails. Somebody else wrote those emails instead of him. That was kind of his defense in the case. It didn't work. But let's get to sentencing here. Bank fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion, a lot of them carry with them 30-year sentences. So how does that work? Is it 30 years stacked on each other? Explain the federal sentencing guidelines and how we get to a 12 and 7-year sentence.
Okay. Well, in federal court, we have sentencing guidelines, and they're written guidelines for the court in order to try to standardize across the country the same sentence for the same type of crime. So they wrote these guidelines. And these guidelines can be ignored, I would say it that way, by the judges if they want to. But if they do ignore the guidelines, they have to have a good reason, because the guidelines are presumed a reasonable sentence. So judges try to stay within the guidelines so there really isn't any challenge to their sentence. That's the easy way to go. In this case, we have guidelines, and a lot of people say, gosh, there were, I think, 5 counts of bank fraud. And that's 30 years apiece. So that could be 150 years. Not the way the sentencing guidelines work. If you have related cases, for instance, 5 counts of bank fraud, they grouped those. And that's the actual word you use in the guidelines. You group them into a single guideline score. So bank fraud starts out at a level 7. The way the guidelines work is it's a grid. On the left side of the grid are the score of the offenses. The top of the grid, prior convictions. In this case, they have no prior convictions, so they're going to be in the first block. So then on the side, you start using numbers. Number 7, bank fraud, 7 levels. But then what really drives these guidelines are the dollars. And the more you steal, the higher your guideline score. In this case, they were from 9.5 million to 25 million, even though I know they alleged 30 and 36. Apparently, they actually proved at trial between 9.5 and 25 million.
Isn't that funny?
They don't have to.
But isn't that funny? What is that? Doesn't that remind you of our trial where they started out with millions of dollars?
Yes.
And as we went through the evidence, it was like $27,000 is what they said this doctor defrauded Medicare. So this happens all the time where they say a certain number, but when the evidence actually comes out, it can be a much smaller number. And that's really interesting, right? They're just allowed to do that. They're not held to their burden to actually prove the number that they choose with years of investigation and years of documents and evidence. You'd think they'd be able to come up with the number, but a lot of times it comes out as a smaller number. Here, 36 to 25 million, still a pretty big deal, much different than our case. But I just want to point that out. That reminded me of our case.
And you're exactly right. When it really comes down to trial, a lot of times they can't prove all the numbers, and they don't have to prove all the numbers, just enough to convict you. So here we got up to 25 million. Well, that raises that 7 to 27. That's a 20 level increase. And they also did some other things. When you file bankruptcy and you make a misrepresentation in your bankruptcy, it's an additional 2 levels up. So they got 2 levels for that bankruptcy they filed that was a fraud. They got 2 more levels for sophisticated means. And by the way, all of these were challenged by the defense. The defense saying, oh, this was not sophisticated. The dollars weren't really 25 million. So they challenged all of this stuff factually in the sentencing, but the judge didn't buy it. The judge ruled that it was a sophisticated means, so they got a 2 level increase. They derived from more than $1 million of receipts from a financial institution. They really protect financial institutions. And therefore, they gave them an increase because they stole from $1 million from a federally funded financial institution. Aggravating role and obstruction. Aggravating role means you are a leader. If you're a leader in a criminal enterprise, you get levels up. And if you obstructed justice, in this case, they gave false documents to the grand jury. They also encouraged, the mother and their daughter to lie to the grand jury. All of that is obstructing justice. They got a 2 level increase. So they had a lot of increases. So when it came down to it, they ended up, at least Todd, ended up with a 37 as his total score. So go down the thing, you get to 37, you move to the right, and there is a range. By range, I mean a level 37 can be a sentence of 210 months to 262 months. If the judge sentences within that range, then the judge's sentence is considered reasonable, and that's for Todd. Julie did not get quite as high. She got a level 32, so she was 121 months to 151 months was her range. So again, the judge used that, as he's supposed to, in determining the sentence. And he could have gone higher, like I said, but he didn't really want to sit there and go through a bunch of reasons to justify it. It's easier just to go ahead and go with the range, and then you have a presumed reasonable sentence.
And both of these sentences were within the ranges.
They're within the ranges. And like I said, there are weeks of classes on sentencing guidelines. The book is about that thick. So the federal sentencing guidelines are very complicated. And that's why when you have to go through here, you've got to do grouping. You've got to go all through your aggravating factors. You got to go through the dollars to see where, and so you've got all these moving parts till you finally come up with a number. And that number, the pre-sentence report that's done by probation is secret. I can't see it. You can't see it. But I did see and read the U.S. Attorney's Office sentencing memorandum. And it looks like this memorandum mirrored what the probation office was also recommended. So I think that they were in sync, and the defense didn't have a chance at that point because 2 out of the 3 players in giving the judge a score agreed on a score.
And that's not uncommon for the government to be high, defense to be low. They're right now being held on house arrest, I think, where all of this stuff was happening. And that's probably what they asked for, is to do this on house arrest. But you think they're actually going to serve time in federal prison, right? Somebody asked that question. Do we think they're actually going to serve time? I think the answer would be a resounding yes.
Yes. One other thing, too, when you mentioned the 3 years of supervised release, that's required. Anybody who goes to prison has to have a period of supervised release when they get out. In this case, this type of crime, this sentence means that they're going to have 3 years of supervised release. They're also going to have 16 months of probation, from what I read.
Okay. And RF and a couple people said they're going to go in January. That's not unusual to give them time through the holidays before they actually have to go in and start serving their sentence. Mindy asked, can they get out for good behavior? How does that work in federal court?
They don't have parole anymore. So they're going to have to serve probably 85% of their sentence. There's also a halfway house situation where during the last 6 months of their sentence, if they qualify, if they've been good, they'll go to a halfway house for 6 months to reintroduce them to society. So they'll serve a good portion of that sentence.
Cap Truck says politicians and famous people do this all the time. Al, Sharon, H, Biden, a lot of people saying Trump. This is some of the stuff people are saying about Trump and other rich and famous people trying to get around taxes. What Why choose? Why do federal prosecutors choose some and not others? Does it just come down to, like what you said in the beginning, the most evidence, the most sure chance at a conviction, high profile is good. But if you swing for the fences and you miss, that can be embarrassing as a federal prosecutor, right? If you go after anybody with the last name Biden or Trump and you miss, that's going to be embarrassing. And everybody's going to call you, a political, extremist or whatever. So, you have to pick your battles as a federal prosecutor. And somebody like Todd Chrisley, when you feel like you've got enough evidence, they're high profile enough, you can go get a win, you take it, but you don't always swing for the fences as a federal prosecutor, right?
I got to tell you, again, looking at the evidence in this case, you don't have that kind of really good evidence in every tax case you have. You don't have emails actually telling your accountant to, reduce your taxes or lie about your income. They had some really, really good, solid stuff,
right,
in this case, and transferring the corporation to your mother, those kind of things to hide giving away. It's, again, you look at these huge, they're the fabulously wealthy people. Think how complicated their tax structure is, and think how many corporations they have intertwined and all that. Proving that they actually intended to defraud is the hardest thing to do. Because I'll bet you, I would think he's smart enough. I bet you that Trump doesn't have an email to his accountant saying, make sure you lie about my income on my taxes. This is an unusual situation, and that's why it made it so solid for the prosecutor to try.
Yeah, and Kat saying using loopholes is one thing, fraud is another. Absolutely. That's why everybody doesn't get prosecuted. And Billy said, if you're rich, why risk your freedom to save money on taxes? You can afford to pay your fair share. Well, people are greedy, right? I mean, that's what it really comes down to. It is generally people are greedy and they never feel like they have enough. Well, how much is enough? Just a little bit more. Somebody said Rockefeller or something. Ship's Cat, woohoo, 2 live experts in one day. Cat in Virginia, never understood why anybody watched that show. Well, like millions of people watched it and they made a ton of money on it. Cole Campo, can appeal keep them out? So let's talk about the appeal. In these kinds of cases, generally, it doesn't specifically have to be this case. What are the best arguments on appeal that usually even have a chance at working? Because again, 90+% of appeals lose, especially in federal court with these types of cases, these types of prosecutors, agents being the investigating officers. But what are some common arguments made in appeals in these kinds of white collar cases?
Well, first off, they'll appeal the calculations. Did they calculate the loss right, the tax loss? Secondly, they'll appeal my guess is that there were a bunch of subpoenas and grand jury subpoenas. Were they lawful? Were they constitutional? Was there any unlawful seizures made in the case? Was there any unlawful searches? Was the accountant? Did they have any? There's no federal accountant privilege. There is a state one, funny enough, but there's no federal accountant privilege. But maybe they went and searched the accountant's office and they didn't have the right search warrant, or something was wrong with their search warrant. They're all technical aspects of the appeal. In this case, they have very little that they can do. Oh, maybe the government didn't give them everything. Maybe the government didn't turn over some documents that would have helped them. Maybe the government did something wrong in the grand jury when they got the indictments. Those are all aspects that they should look at. I think the interesting thing too, that question also asks, are they going to be out during the appeal? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really good question, because you're not automatically entitled to a bond as much as you are when you're first charged. Once you're convicted, there's no presumption of innocence. So they have to prove to the judge, number one, they're not a flight risk. And number two, they have good grounds for appeal, because you don't get out while the appeal is pending unless a judge thinks you have good grounds. So they have the burden of proof now in order to stay out during the course of the appeal. Oh, also, lastly, restitution. Restitution hasn't been decided yet, how much they're going to owe, and that's going to be an appellate issue.
Stephanie Tam says, hey, Peter, why didn't you get your dad's good looks? Only God knows. Rosie,
this isn't blinding you. I'm not noticing the light here. I don't know if that's blinding him.
Male pattern baldness. Rosie, kicking in for your dad's time. Much appreciated. Thank you, Rosie. Veronica, in this case, what would be a loophole that could have been legal as opposed to fraud they committed? One that I can think of is the legitimate use of a corporation like 7Cs, right? if they have a reality TV show and a lot of what you're doing is for the reality TV show, let's think about YouTube, right? Think about Mr. Beast, if any of you know who that is, one of the biggest YouTube channels out there. This guy gives away like Lamborghinis and $1 million in his videos, right? So if he makes $1 million but spends $10 million on his video, he's actually not making any money and he is broke, right? And he has said stuff like that. I'm sure he makes plenty of money, but I'm saying you get the idea with that. So if the Chrisleys were spending all this money to make sure they seemed a certain way for their TV show, and therefore they were using it as business expenses, that would have been a loophole. Even though they're eating at the fancy restaurants and they have the big house and they have the expensive clothes, they could still potentially be broke. Now, whether or not that would be a legitimate loophole would be up for discussion, but that's one that I can think of. Can you think of any other ones?
Well, one, and it's one that we're familiar with in a way. These reality TV shows aren't really reality TV shows. They are scripted. And so a lot of the things that they said on the show,
right,
that they used against them in the trial were actually scripted. These people, I mean, it's not an ad lib. If anybody thinks these reality TV shows are ad libs, I'm selling them a bridge. But you really, what's another loophole when they say, look, they used this stuff against me saying it's an admission in trial. It was just something that we had to say because it was scripted and the writers wrote it. And that's something that I'm sure they used in trial, and it's something they might be able to use in the appeal, but it wasn't an admission.
Yeah, that's a good point. That other places have used that. That's not actually really what they've said. Thank you, Jeannie Nash, for the super chat. John O'Rourke, when did they stop offering parole in federal court?
Quite a while ago. Pretty much when they started sentencing guidelines. It was. I mean, I remember parole, so I mean, it wasn't like it was 100 years ago, but it could have been 30 or 40 years ago that they stopped.
Billy G, don't tell me it's scripted. No, still believe in WWF and the Easter Bunny. Yeah, we already mentioned Hulk Hogan once, right? When wrestling also, it might not be real, guys. I hate to break it to you. All right, we got about 5 more minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions about this case specifically. Lois asked, could they have hidden money, Peter? Most rich people can have hidden money somewhere. Somebody else asked if they were broke. Did you read anything that showed whether or not they still had any money stashed somewhere, bank accounts frozen? Do they have any assets, houses, things like that? I know that the government has already, I don't know if they put liens or what the government does. Well, I've got another question to ask after this, but have you read anything about whether they have any money hidden?
No, I mean, I obviously read where they put a lot of money, and the government has found a lot of money in different places. But I don't know if they have anything overseas and numbered accounts in Switzerland and those kind of things, where they're harder and harder to find places like that because they have treaties now, even with Switzerland, and they're able to go and recoup money even from Swiss bank accounts now. That's a kind of a semi thing of the past. It's a lot harder to hide money.
Rich Cat asked, would you enjoy representing these kinds of clients, George or Peter? I'm sure you would. It's not as much my style.
As long as the government didn't come and seize my fees, which, by the way, the government does do sometimes. If they know you're taking fees and if they can prove the fees come from illegal activity, then they can come and seize your fees and you end up representing them for nothing.
So one of the other questions, I think Billy G or somebody posted in the chat, there's no debtor's prison, right? If I don't pay you money I owe you, you can't throw me in prison. So what's the public policy behind tax evasion and not giving the government the money that's rightfully theirs?
Well, the thing is fraud. That's why, and you're right. That's why when the IRS says you owe us $10,000 because this trip to Europe was not a business trip and you shouldn't have deducted it. Well, in a debtor's prison, they could put you in prison for deducting it because you didn't pay them. But when you add the concept of fraud or intentional fraud, that's when it becomes criminal. So that's the difference between just owing money and being a fraud.
Paraka asks, what do they need to be careful about in regards to their probation after they get out? Like not refusing to pay taxes or doing shows. They can probably do shows again. The government probably wants them to make money to pay those back taxes, but they probably will set up something with the IRS to pay taxes when they do it quarterly or whatever. They'll probably have to do things like that, right?
Well, Well, they're actually probably going to have to tell the probation officer every time they spend more than $500 or
No, it's right now. It's $1,000 is what it says. Yeah, anytime they spend more than $1,000.
Right. So if they have to tell their probation officer for every dime they spend, and they've got to come in and give the probation officer an accounting, they're going to be closely watched to make sure that they don't have any more money.
Gene said Elizabeth Holmes got 11.5 years. What she did was 100 times worse. That'd be interesting. We'll ask Pete about it. He's on vacation this week, but we'll ask him to compare and contrast these two to see what he thinks and what's worse. Lee Watson, what is supervised release versus probation?
Almost no difference. There really isn't. I don't even know why they gave him that 16-month probation when I read it, because there's going to be 3 years of supervised release. There is almost no difference unless they're stacking it. Unless the judge said 16 months probation followed by 3 years of supervised release, then there would be a difference because it would extend the time. But as far as the amount of supervision, it's about the same.
Rosie said, had lunch once with Judge Coffenor in Seattle. He gave 6 months off a guy's sentence for every B he got in college. Do federal judges have more leeway? I've never heard of that.
I haven't heard of that either. And it would be unusual for him to change the sentence once he gave it. Now, maybe if it was, that really is kind of not, I've actually seen that in state court, but I've really never seen that in federal court.
If it's a kid and they're doing something to try to help the kid, or maybe they build something in, or maybe we're talking probation, 6 months off is probation. You can do some kind of early termination of probation.
Right.
Maybe. I'm not positive.
Yeah.
Lexix, thank you for the super sticker. So EJ said, I mentioned the staggering of the kids. Somebody else posted in the chat that the judge already said they won't stagger the age of the kids. Yes, the age and dependency of the kids matter. I don't know how old his kids are. I know he's got some.
They also try to tell the judge that he's apparently there's a mother that's aged or has some issues or something. They use that as well.
She is also on the show. I remember seeing her on the show. I can't remember what she looked like, but or how old she was back then, I should say. There was something else. Oh, what are some of the major differences between state and federal sentencing? Like how would you describe what the differences are? Just the guidelines? Is that simply it?
The state guidelines are simpler. They're more black and white. It's either this or it's that. Federal guidelines have just become so complicated that they have all these aggravators. States normally don't have these many aggravators. Also in state court, realize the cases they bring in state court aren't anywhere near on the average as complex as federal cases. These smaller cases, the feds don't even bring. The feds don't even bring generally small drug cases anymore. Those are all state cases. So the complexity of the case and the complexity of the guidelines make a big difference.
Okay. Will they make them sell that big house as part of restitution? Restitution has not been determined yet. How does it work if they have some kind of homesteading laws? Do they make you sell that house? How can the government, because a normal person in Florida, you can't sue somebody. I can't sue you, Dad, get a $10 million judgment and take your house away from you. It's protected by homestead. How does it work in federal white collar cases like this with restitution?
If they could trace that the money came from the fraudulent conduct to buy the house, then they can take the house just based on that. So if they can claim, all right, they made a couple of their mortgage payments from the fraudulent conduct, bam, the house is gone. If the house, plus in this case, actually they might be able to say the house was an instrumentality of the crime because they used the house to promote themselves in order for them to be able to do the fraud. Saying,
and they may have even used
big house.
They may have even used the house to prove that they have all this money, or use the house to prove that they're bankrupt. They could have used the house fraudulently in both ways, right? The payments on the house is the reason we don't have any money, number one, and we have to pay for our family to live here. And number two, the house is how we're, the rich and famous and big shots on the show.
Right.
Tori said, I found out these reality shows are given houses to use for the show. Well, that would obviously change things if somebody was not didn't have homestead or own the house or make payments on the house. That would obviously change things, but I have no idea about that. Do you have any info on that?
My understanding is they did buy the house.
Okay.
They did own the house.
P-Hop said, this makes a lot more sense now. Thanks to both of you for explaining it. And like he said, these federal sentencing guidelines are very complicated. These federal white collar crimes, there aren't a ton of lawyers that handle these kinds of cases. A lot of them that do are former federal prosecutors, because you learn the ins and outs and what they look for and how the enhancements work and how the federal judges work when you're on the prosecutor side. So it is very complicated and very different from state cases. So this is another question I get a lot, and you can explain it better. How do you choose, or how does it get chosen of whether or not it's going to be a federal case or a state case? Because these banks, right? These banks can be state banks inside the state. Why isn't it a state bank fraud?
Because, well, most all, even state chartered banks are federally insured.
The FDIC, right? That's
right. So
right.
The FDIC, if you're an FDIC bank, even if you're a state chartered bank, that would still be a federal crime to defraud a FDIC insured bank. Normally, it really comes down to, they have what's called the declination policy at the Department of Justice. If it isn't over a certain dollar amount, and that dollar amount changes and fluctuates, just like a drug case. If it's not a certain amount of drugs, if we don't have a pound of fentanyl as opposed to an ounce of fentanyl, then if it's an ounce, give it to the state. The other thing that matters is what agency found the crime. Was it a federal agency that tripped over it, or was it a state agency? A lot of times state agencies don't like giving up their cases to federal prosecutors. They like to keep the state prosecutors in state agencies. So it depends on the agency, depends on the level of crime, and it depends on the amounts.
Yeah, and the IRS, obviously, federal agency. So that's why the tax evasion and that fraud goes there. Wire fraud and bank fraud also, and money laundering a lot of times crosses state lines, right? So
those are, by the way, people don't realize it, but agencies have certain guidelines too that they have to follow. The IRS, these are their designated type crimes. The IRS doesn't go out and bust drug dealers. So, it all depends on the type of crime as to the agency that actually will develop it and will work the case.
Right. And again, and that's why how it affects the economy, how it affects the country, how it affects multiple states, all of that can become an issue and something that the federal government is more interested in than just making it a state case. And that's really how they're all looked at from time to time. Jeannie is a new member. Awesome. Jeannie and Barbara asked, Peter, are you going to do lives this week? So we have one more sidebar coming out, and it's actually the one my dad is in. We have, I think we're going to start a new short series. Hopefully that we'll have out either tomorrow or Friday. So that'll be a new something fun we're going to do. And then what I'm going to try to do, I haven't decided when, maybe I'll do it tomorrow, just kind of a fun, relaxed Thanksgiving type episode, talk our favorite foods, our favorite sides, favorite things to watch, do Thanksgiving traditions. We might do that, kind of just a chill hangout video tomorrow. Keep it kind of low pace. The office is going to be slow. We'll be tying up some loose ends, things like that. But we will be doing some other videos this week. Yes. All right. I think that's it. So thanks, Dad, for joining me. Thanks, everybody, for jumping in here. Hit the like button on your way out. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button. If you have more questions about this case, please put them in the comments. And I always try to get to as many questions as possible. If we weren't able to get to yours today, I'm sorry, but I will continue to try to answer as many questions. That's what makes these videos so fun. But that's all we got for you. And thanks, Dad, for coming on.
Nope. Enjoyed it.